Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to the GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIC's first Korea Policy Forum event of 2026. My name is Celeste Arrington, and I'm a professor of political science and international affairs at the George Washington University, as well as the director of GWICS. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today. I wish I could be welcoming you on campus, but unfortunately, due to the snow, GW remains closed. And so thank you all for your flexibility in shifting this seminar to an online format. I also want to especially thank the GWIC staff, Habin Peck and Ravina Ugale, for shifting everything online, and also for the brains behind all of our policy-related programming at GWICS, Yono Kim, for organizing today's seminar. Especially to our distinguished speakers, I appreciate their flexibility as well in shifting to this online format. So we have a great lineup today, so I'm going to keep my opening remarks very brief. Let me first begin by saying we will have a pre-recorded set of remarks from Representative Lee So-young, who is a member of the National Assembly of South Korea, and she's affiliated with the Democratic Party of Korea. She's also a member of the Strategy and Finance Committee, and has been previous to joining or being elected to the National Assembly. She was an attorney specializing in environmental and energy law. And she will offer us some reflections 1 year and a bit after former President Yoon Suk-Yeol's declaration of martial law in December of 2024. After her remarks, I will introduce our three distinguished speakers for the panel discussion. But for right now, I'm going to ask you to pay attention to the video that Representative Lee sent us.
네, 안녕하세요. 대한민국 국회의원 이소영입니다. 저는 현재 대한민국에서 여당을 맡고 있는 더불어민주당에 소속되어 있습니다. 먼저 이렇게 영상으로 인사드릴 수 있어서 영광이고요. 오늘 저에게 주어진 주제가 다소 무겁고 어떤 말씀을 드려야 할지 어렵게 느껴지기도 하는데, 최근 대한민국에서 있었던 제가 직접 경험한 여러 가지 일들에 대해서 오늘 공유해드리는 것으로 이 시간을 보내보려고 합니다. 음, 먼저 한국 민주주의에 대해서 관심을 많이 가져주셔서 감사합니다. 대한민국의 정치도 많은 위기 속에 있는 것은 사실입니다. 음, 한국 정치는 국민들로부터 큰 불신을 받고 있고요. 여느 나라에서와 같이 정치적 양극화가 점점 극심해지고 있습니다. 그래서 정치적 견해가 다른 정파들 사이에 대화와 타협이 실종되어 가고, 그것은 우리 민주주의와 한국 정치에 큰 위협이 되고 있는 것도 사실입니다. 그런데 오늘 이 행사의 소개 말에도 있었던 것 같은데, 그럼에도 불구하고 한국 정치가 양극화의 위협과 이런 불신의 위기를 겪고 있음에도 불구하고 아시아에서 가장 민주주의의 회복력이 높은 국가다라고 평가해 주시는 데에는 최근 두 번의 2016년과 2024년의 대통령 탄핵 과정에서 대한민국 국민들이 보여준 모습, 그리고 국민들의 요구에 따라 대한민국의 입법부와 사법부와 그리고 행정부 일각에서 보여준 모습, 그런 모습들이 대한민국 사회는 외부에서나 내부에서 어떠한 충격이 가해지더라도 국민들이 앞장서서 그것을 빠르게 바로 잡는구나. 그리고 망가지지 않게 국민들이 나서서 그 과정을 주관하는구나. 아마 그렇게 평가하고 계실 것 같습니다. 저도 그렇게 평가합니다. 그래서 그런 어떤 과정들을 거쳐서 계엄을 선포한 대통령에게 헌법적 절차를 통한 탄핵을 선고할 수 있었고, 또 그 이후 대선과 그 정치 과정들 속에서 이제 사회가 어떻게 회복할 수 있었는지를 좀 말씀드려보고자 합니다. 음, 2024년 12월 3일이었고요. 윤석열 당시 대통령의 계엄령 선포는 아마 대한민국 국민들뿐만 아니라 세계 모든 분들이 음, 굉장히 놀라고 황당했을 거라고 생각합니다. 전혀 합리성을 갖추지 않은 너무나 엉뚱한 또 엉뚱하다라고만 표현하기에는 굉장히 위협적인 일이었죠. 그리고 계엄령을 선포하고 바로 직후에 한 일은 국회에 군대를 보낸 일이었습니다. 대한민국은 계엄령 선포가 아주 오래전에 경험을 가지고 있지만 그때도 군인들을 국회에 보내지는 않았기 때문에 이번에는 정말 역사상 최초로 있는 상황이었습니다. 그런데 대통령이 밤 10시가 넘어서 뉴스에서 계엄령을 선포하고 국회로 경찰과 군대를 보내는 동안 경찰과 군인들보다 국민들이 먼저 국회에 도착해서 국회를 지키기 위해 국회를 애워쌌습니다. 그래서 그 국민들의 도움을 받아서 경찰과 군인들을 뚫고 국회의원들이 회의장에 집합할 수 있었고요. 밤 10시가 넘어서 계엄령 선포가 됐지만 새벽 1시 무렵에 국회가 정상적으로 계엄 해제 의결을 할 수 있었습니다. 그리고 현재 여당, 그때는 야당이었죠. 민주당과 야당의 의석만으로는 대통령 탄핵 정족수를 맞출 수 없는 상황이었지만 대통령이 속한 여당에서조차도 이 계엄과 내란에 동의할 수 없고 탄핵 사유가 성립됐다는 것을 여러 명이 인정하고 찬성 표결을 하면서 약 2주 만에 대통령 탄핵 의결에도 성공할 수 있었습니다. 그리고 그 계엄 당일에 불과 몇 시간 만에 국회가 해제 의결 표결을 할 수 있었던 것은 사실 그 당시에 국회에 출동했던 경찰과 군인들의 소극적 저항 덕분이기도 합니다. 아무런 무기를 들고 있지 않은 국회 직원들과 보좌진들, 국회의원들이 막는다고 해서 아주 특수한 훈련을 받은 군인들이 국회 본회의장에 침투하지 못할 이유는 없었을 텐데, 그런 물리적인 우위에도 불구하고 그 군인들 스스로가 아주 소극적으로나마 이 일의 부당함을 느끼고 소극적 저항을 했기 때문에 사실은 새벽 1시에 그런 해제 의결을 할 수 있었다고 생각을 합니다. 그리고 실제로 계엄령 선포가 되고 나서 법무부 감찰관을 비롯한 여러 정의로운 공무원들이 사직 의사를 표시하거나 실제로 선관위 투입을 지시받은 특전사 군인들이 어, 태업을 통해서 그런 일에 저항을 하기도 했었습니다. 그래서 행정부 일각에서도 그런 어리석은 부당한 결정을 한 최고위층을 제외하고는 이 일에 적극적으로 가담하지 않았고 그것이 또 이번 사건에서 우리가 볼 수 있는 굉장히 중요한 어, 점이었다고 생각을 합니다. 그러나 물론 헌법과 법제도가 완벽했던 것은 아닙니다. 저희도 이번 과정을 거치면서 많은 논란과 많은 빈 공간들을 맞닥뜨리게 됐었는데요. 가령 대한민국 헌법상 행정부 내부의 견제 장치라고 할 수 있는 국무회의가 이 과정에서 정상적으로 작동하지 않았습니다. 대통령의 계엄령 발령은 국무회의, 국무위원들, 장관들이 모여서 같이 국무회의 심의를 거쳐야 하고 자신의 서명을 그 문서에 이제 부서해야 되는 헌법상 의무가 있습니다. 그러나 국무위원들이 국무회의 정족수를 충족시킬 수 있는 만큼 그날 밤에 모였음에도 불구하고 대통령의 이런 반헌법적인 계엄령을 전혀 막지 못하고 국무위원들 중에 누구도 이 일을 막기 위해서, 그 발표를 막기 위해서 본인의 직이나 본인의 직을 걸거나 위험을 무릅쓴 사람은 없었습니다. 저는 이번에 행정부 내부에서의 국무회의라고 하는 장치가 제대로 작동하지 않은 것은 앞으로 대한민국의 정치와 행정의 운영에 있어서 큰 교훈으로 삼고 어, 개선해 나가야 되는 문제라고 다른 방안을 찾아야 되는 문제라고 생각을 했습니다. 헌법재판소 탄핵 심판 과정에서도 참 위기가 많았습니다. 총 9명의 헌법재판관이 원래 존재해야 하는데요. 대통령의 계엄령 발령 당시에는 국회 추천의 3명의 재판관이 임기를 마치고 공석인 상태였습니다. 그런데 그 당시에 대통령의 계엄을 옹호하던 당시 여당 일각에서는 대통령의 탄핵 의결 이후 그 직무를 대행하게 되는 권한대행이 그 3명을 임명할 수 없다. 대통령의 헌법재판관 임명권을 대행할 수 없다라는 논리를 펼치면서 권한대행의 헌법재판관 추가 임명을 가로막았고요. 실제로 기존 국무총리였던 권한대행이 그 임명을 거부하면서 실제로 탄핵 심판 자체가 진행될 수 없을 뻔한 그런 과정을 거치기도 했습니다. 물론 그 과정에서 일부 정치인들의 판단과 결단, 그리고 국민들의 강력한 의지, 이런 것들을 통해서 헌법재판관 임명 거부를 통해 탄핵 심판 자체를 무산시키려고 하는 한덕수 전 국무총리, 당시 권한대행을 탄핵시키고 그 다음 권한대행이 들어와서야 3명 중에 1명의 이 재판관을 임명하면서 7인의 심리 정족수를 맞출 수 있게 되었습니다. 대통령이 계엄을 일으키고 탄핵 의결이 된 상황에서 헌법재판소가 이렇게 작동 여부에 대한 논란이 생길 수 있다라는 점도 크고 작은 제도상의 흠결이라고 이번에 우리가 발견하게 되었었고요. 또 국회가 탄핵 의결한 여러 가지 탄핵 사유 중에 재판 지연을 초래할 수 있는 사유를 사후적으로 철회한 것에 대해서도 어, 여야가 정치적 입장에 따라서 기존 국회의 탄핵 의결의 유무효를 다투는 그런 여러 법적, 정치적 논쟁들이 수개월간 계속 이어졌습니다. 그러나 결국에는 국민들의 아주 명확한 판단, 그리고 강력한 의지, 그에 기한 입법부, 사법부, 행정부의 크고 작은 여러 의사결정들이 모이고 모여서 결국에는 탄핵 심판에서 만장일치로 탄핵 결정이 내려졌습니다. 그때 모두가 주목했던 것은 탄핵 대상인 윤석열 대통령 자신이 임명한 재판관이 그 탄핵 심판의 주심을 맡았고 또 헌법재판소 7인의 재판관 중에 보수적인 성향으로 분류되는 재판관들이 분명히 복수로 존재했음에도 불구하고 만장일치 탄핵 결정이 나왔다는 것입니다. 저는 그 사실에서도 우리가 볼 수 있는 것은 대한민국의 사법부라고 하는 권력이 독자적으로 국민과 유리되어서 어떤 판단을 하는 것이 아니라 국민들의 의지와 판단에 구속되는 모습을 보여줬다는 점에서 그것이 또 대한민국 사회의 제도적인 회복력의 하나의 요소가 아닌가 그런 생각을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 대한민국은 2016년에도 그리고 8년 후인 2024년에도 국민들이 선출한 대통령이 허용할 수 없는, 헌법과 국민이 허용할 수 없는 일을 저지를 때마다 음, 용인하지 않고, 그것을 용인하지 않고, 기다리지 않고, 거리에 나와서 저항권을 행사했고, 그 저항권이 제도 바깥에 머무른 것이 아니라 제도 안으로 항상 연결되면서 여야의 정파를 넘어서 국회가 그 국민의 의사를 받들고, 국회의 대다수가요. 전부는 아니지만, 그리고 사법부도 개개인의, 판사 개개인의 정치적 성향에 갇히지 않고 국민들의 의지를 존중하고 그것이 문화적, 관행적으로 요구되고 또 행정부 역시도 대통령이 매우 위험한 결정을 하고 추진할 때 그런 것들에 대한 적극적, 소극적 저항을 이어가면서 이 두 번의 큰 사건에서의 역사를 만들었다고 생각합니다. 어떻게 유독 대한민국에서 이렇게 비교적 단기간에 이런 회복력을 보여줄 수 있는 두 번의 일이 일어났는지에 대해서는 제가 설명하거나 평가하기에는 참 조심스러운 측면이 있습니다. 그 부분은 오늘 토론자로 나서주시는 분들께서 좋은 의견을 많이 주시면 좋겠고요. 세계의 많은 분들이 또 민주주의를 연구하는 많은 학자분들이 대한민국을 주목하고 계시다는 것을 알고 있습니다. 이 아주 이례적이고 특수한 상황에서의 회복력을 넘어서 대한민국 민주주의를 실질적으로 더 강화하고 양극화된 정치에서 대화와 타협을 복원해서 이 양극화로 인한 위협을 없애는 것이 민주주의, 대한민국의 민주주의를 더 한 단계 성숙시키는 일이라고 생각합니다. 대한민국 국민들이 늘 우리 민주주의 지키셨던 것처럼 또 대한민국의 정치인들에게는 그러한 회복력이 필요할 정도의 그런 사고가 생기지 않게끔 이 정치와 민주주의를 성숙시키는 것이 또 과제로 주어지고 있다고 생각합니다. 오늘 제 말씀 이후에 여러 나누어지는 토론 내용도 제가 함께 듣고 또 대한민국 정치 발전에 좋은 자양분으로 삼도록 하겠습니다. 여러분 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Representative Lee So-young, for your video remarks. I think this was a helpful reminder, sort of from an insider in the from the National Assembly's perspective of the last year and a bit events that have unfolded in Korean democracy. Our theme for today is the resilience of Korean democracy, and I think Representative Lee ended us well on this point of democracy is resilient, but we have still more work to do. And so it's my great honor to welcome now three esteemed speakers. Our first speaker will be Stephen Costello. His probably biggest claim to fame is being a non-resident visiting scholar at GWIX. But more importantly, he has a long career of political consultancy, policy analysis, and commentary in the U.S. ROK relationship. And for example, he served as director of the Korean Transition Program at the Atlantic Council and writes frequently about South Korean politics. I will be asking him specifically to speak on the strengths and vulnerabilities that have become visible in democratic institutions in Korea. Representative Lee highlighted the ways in which the three branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, responded to President Yoon's declaration of martial law. But as you reflect back on the last year, what are some of the positives and then the remaining vulnerabilities that you see in this institutional response? Our second speaker, I'm also very pleased to introduce to you is Hwang Hae-kyung, who's a journalist at YTN, Korea's first 24-hour news channel. She comes to us with more than 20 years of journalistic experience. In particular, she covered the elections of President Yoon Suk-Yeol in 2022, as well as prior elections. And most notably, she is a visiting scholar at GWIX. So it's my great pleasure to introduce her to you. And then last but definitely not least, an old friend, Andrew Yeol, is a senior fellow and the SK Korea Foundation Chair at the Brookings Institution. And he will be focused on the foreign policy implications of the aftermath of the 12-3 declaration of martial law. Andrew is a familiar face probably to many of you around DC. He's also a professor of politics at the Catholic University of America in DC and has written a number of different books. He's currently working on one that examines narratives in the development of South Korean grand strategies. So this positions him very well to speak about the foreign policy implications. And I forgot to mention that Hwang Hae-kyung will be focusing on the party politics dynamics and how parties and political elites have responded in the aftermath of the declaration of martial law. So needless to say, we have a lot to cover. I'm going to turn the floor now over to Stephen as our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Celeste. I really appreciate the invitation to be with you guys. Our timing is, of course, amazing, not only for what's going on in South Korea, but for what's going on elsewhere. And also to thank Yan-Ho Kim and the rest of you at the George Washington Institute for Korea Studies. I think you are, without a doubt, the best institute for South Korea in Washington, which is a big deal. That was wonderful to hear Assemblywoman Lee So-young. That on-the-ground report was really riveting. And I could listen to her quite a bit more. I'm going to give something of an overview, looking at the institutional reactions and the institutional background of the executive, legislative, and judicial aspects of Korea. So let me start from there. At the beginning, I do want to acknowledge the passing last week of one of the giants of South Korea's democracy, Lee Hae-chan. He was far more than just one more good democratic advisor to many presidents and parties. Along with Kim Dae-jung and Kim Gun-tae and other democratic giants, he really made a big difference in the strategies and the way that South Korean democracy was prosecuted and the way it went along. Also, just as a person, he was quite an amazing guy. You can tell from the tears shed by so many people, the images coming out the last few days of his returning from Vietnam and now his funeral coming up. I do hope that any of you who are interested in South Korean democracy take the time to go to a Korean site or elsewhere and look at a bit of the background of Lee Hae-chan. Many similarities exist between South Korean and American democratic systems. Less than 30 years in the case of South Korea, and coming up on 250 years in the case of the United States. Unresolved and unconfronted anti-democratic elements have persisted after the Civil War, both in the US and in South Korea since the Second and Korean Wars. That's a whole subject that needs further exploration, so I'm not going to return to it much. But it's a particular pleasure, and I think it's a great advantage to be able to watch South Korea's democracy dealing with these issues of a recent martial law declaration, an impeachment, and then the election of a new president and the new government trying to somehow strengthen their democratic systems. The modern Korean democratic era runs more effectively through the 80s to the election of 1997, when the democratic forces for the first time gained power. When I refer to democratic forces and democratic individuals, I'm talking about small d Democrats across Korea. That's important in 1997 and 1998 because that's the first time ever that the forces, the democratic forces, achieved power. So since then, it's been very much a shortened version in South Korea, a shortened version of the US experience with democratic institutions, which has occurred since Reconstruction after our own Civil War. So for us, it's been 250 years. For South Korea, it's been about 28 years. Now the Democrats in Korea are trying in multiple ways to adjust the system to make it impossible for another dictator or authoritarian to take power again. I'm going to use these 28 years as a useful time frame in which to place the Yoon Suk-Yeol insurrection of 3 December 2024. The South Korean political system is modeled on the US system with the separation of powers. This is not surprising given our very close alliance and our very close relationships for 80 years at the very least. So, how have South Korea's main pillars of institutional democracy reacted to that insurrection? Where were the strengths and weaknesses of these systems? And how's the current government attempting to change these structures so that future insurrections become almost impossible? Of course, we know that they're never impossible. These are human systems. First, the executive branch. The South Korean executive is strong, but it's not as strong as the US executive. One simple test of this is the fact that 2 Korean presidents have been impeached. Korea also has a hybrid parliamentary presidential system with a prime minister, which somewhat diffuses power. Nevertheless, the Korean executive is able to twist the law to their preferences by using the powers of personnel appointment and intimidations of various kinds. They've also had broad, quote unquote, emergency powers, as was seen in the declaration of martial law. The growth of a powerful and relatively unaccountable prosecution service has also been a valuable tool for the executive over the past 20 years. Since the Sixth Republic, initiated in 1987, limits on presidential power have gradually been erected. But that power remains so formidable that a tipping point has been reached in South Korea. And that's why you see the struggles that you see today. Today, a broad society-wide effort is underway to newly limit presidential powers while making it more clear which actions constitute impeachable offenses. The effort is also trying to clarify and streamline the legislative and judicial powers so that they could act against executive offenses. These efforts are focused on the prosecution, the National Assembly, and the executive branch. The 3 December insurrection exposed deeply corrupted authority within the executive and out among the ministries. The sentencing of the former Prime Minister, Han Duck-soo, to 23 years in prison just last week exposes this fact of what's happened inside the executive. It would be easy to predict that if the current contemplated changes and strengthening of legal and enforceable guardrails on presidential power are not accomplished, then another insurrection is possible, just 1 or 2 presidencies from now. Moving to the judiciary, legal structures are at the heart of South Korea's overall institutional democratic project. The 3 December insurrection exposed the extent of corruption within the judicial system. That corruption could be seen in the wildly different treatment and interpretations of the law from different legal authorities, from the Seoul District Court to the Supreme Court to the Constitutional Court. Those disparities, which showed the extent of political infection in different courts, have been clearly visible during the past 28 years of Korea's modern democracy, right up to the ruling today by the Seoul District Court of an extremely lenient sentence for the former First Lady. This lack of legal independence is demonstrated. As the current government and assembly try to make changes that would enforce new professionalism on the courts and the court system, these changes are exposed as some of the most difficult to make in an institutional manner. After all, how can judicial performance be made more professional and independent if it's enacted by the other 2 branches of government? As messy as this is, it's also deeply and profoundly necessary for the larger democratic project of South Korea to maintain itself. Again, there are very obvious links to what is being attempted here in the US government. Now on to the National Assembly. The single chamber 300-member legislature has been the backbone of Korea's relatively peaceful transition from dictatorship to authoritarianism to democracy. Established in 1948, the Assembly's functioning gave a measure of legitimacy to undemocratic governments, even as it also funneled the most effective power of democratic movements to change the system. Its functioning is the primary reason that South Korea's transition to democracy was relatively peaceful during that period. During the Yoon insurrection, the Assembly immediately became the central institutional focus for both the president and for opponents of his attempted coup. And we just heard amazing details from Representative Lee, Assemblywoman Lee, just now. The dramatic and unforgettable actions and images from that night will stay in the collective Korean memory for a long, long time. They have already helped to elect the current president, Lee Jae-myung, because of his performance at that time. Today, the Assembly remains the central and appropriate institutional playing field for attempts to modernize and to coup-proof the South Korean system. It is fascinating to watch the intense relationship between the powers of the president and the Blue House on the one hand, and the many factions in the National Assembly on the other hand. But just the transparency of watching this is a rare and beautiful gift to all of us who follow that country's politics. Finally, there are other actors that are very important in this drama. The other essential actors include the labor unions, the broader civil society network in general, as well as business interests and the press. It's important when we dig deeper into the civil society and the public actions at this time to remember that Park Won-sun, former mayor of Seoul, and before that, a longtime human rights lawyer, he almost single-handedly created the civil society network and the laws that could create NGOs in South Korea beginning in the 90s. A very, very big force creating what has become a beautiful and rich network of civil society in South Korea. It's important to call out the former mayor Park Won-sun on this because he had a big, big impact. Finally, I want to point out one big and important element of institutional pressure that was exposed during the night of the coup attempt and in the many months afterward. That's the involvement of the broad public through civic groups, unions, and all age groups. The star of those decisive actions was the involvement of young women. Other groups mattered as well, but the number and ferocity of young women will be remembered, most importantly, by those women themselves. I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think we're going to turn now to the party politics dynamics in the National Assembly and delve more into that with Hae-kyung's presentation.
Thank you. My name is Hae-kyung Hwang, and thank you, Dr. Costello, for sharing your profound insights. You mentioned Lee Hae-chan, and I totally agree with you or mentioned. He's undoubtedly one of the key figures in the history of Korea democracy. And speaking for my personal experience as a journalist, he was an incredibly difficult person to cover because he's very stern and often unfriendly to the press and sometimes even scolding reporters. So, however, I believe that at the very least, he was politicians who know how to negotiate with the opposition and think strategically and act with the entire nation's interests in mind. Following Dr. Costello's presentation, I'd like to discuss how the emergency martial law and the subsequent impeachment have reshaped the political landscape of South Korea. As you know, South Korea single adopts a presidential system, and the election system uses single member districts. So the third party have very little room to gain a foothold. So in the past, many small and medium-sized parties claiming to be centrist created a sensation, but they did not last long before being observed by the two parties. In the 2024 general election, as you see in the map, the newly formed Rebuilding Korea Party and the Reform Party caused a stir and winning an impressive 12 and 3 seats respectively. But they still do not meet the requirements to form a floor negotiation group. So in reality, they lack significant influence. In this situation, what changes did Yoon Suk-Yeol's emergency martial law and impeachment bring to political dynamics of South Korea? If you see the party support ratings before and after the martial law, you can see some points. This is the public opinion poll from Gallup Korea. And since former President Yoon's approval rating remained very low, except for the beginning of his term, the public did not rally behind the ruling People Power Party either. Likewise, voters did not grant the Democratic Party significantly higher support as well. The two parties were like neck and neck in a similar situation. This is because Korean politics has a deeply rooted confrontational structures of Yangnam versus Honam and conservative versus progressive. The results of local or parliamentary elections shows this very clearly. You can see the blue region is Honam and the red region is Yangnam, and you can see a clear division here. But the martial law crisis cracked this structure. If you look at the changes in party support ratings in 2025 here, it's clear that the PPP has lost its significant ground and the number of undecided voters have surged, and the Democratic Party saw a modest increase in support. This shows people started supporting based on values, just rather than just region and ideology. Specifically, who is actually defending the spirit of constitution? Then, what did the PPP do to make this its solid support base leave? You probably know that the National Assembly stopped the President Yoon's martial law in 6 hours by passing a resolution to lift it. But the process leading to impeachment was anything but easy. So, yeah. The atmosphere was extremely hostile, fueled by the fear of a potential second martial law. Despite the urgent public demand for his resignation, the first impeachment bill was rejected due to a lack of quorum. As PPP lawmakers refused to participate in the vote, this boycott triggered a massive backlash, even among their own conservative supporters. The PPP maintained that they did not participate in the votes because they wanted President Yoon to step down voluntarily. I think they might not want to repeat the history of impeaching their own president as they've done President Park Geun-hye. But the subsequent public address by President Yoon changed everything. At that time, he said, martial law is a high-level political decision and an act of governing, and added, I will never give up and will fight to the end so that a group of criminals does not take over the state affairs. In effect, he sent a message to hardline far right forces to protect him, declaring that he would not step down on his own. Because of this, a significant portion of the rational, healthy, moderate conservative forces who are watching the situation turned their back on not only Yoon, but also the PPP, I think. As public criticism, at the time, public criticism grew stronger, the PPP eventually had to participate in the votes for a second impeachment bill. But although they participated, the majority of them opposed the impeachment, so the bill barely passed 204 votes. Among PPP lawmakers, some insist they should break up with the President Yoon and escape the image of insurrectionist force and represent the voice of healthy, rational, conservative wing. But the problem is that they are not the majority. Chang Dong-hyuk, the leader of the PPP, who is in the center of the picture, defended President Yoon last December on the 1 year mark of the martial law declaration, asserting that the martial law was a response to the opposition parliamentary tyranny. Both conservative and progressive media slammed Chang Dong-hyuk's such actions, and with the June elections, local elections coming up, there's a lot of growing anxiety inside the party as well. Realizing they might get crushed in the elections, John recently stepped forward a little bit with a late apology, saying the emergency martial law was a wrong tool that did not fit the situation. However, the internal turmoil has not subsided. Those demanding party reform are mentioning a collective departure and the possibility of forming a new party. Chang Dong-hyuk is pushing for a change of the party name, though I'm not sure if there's any viable names left for them, but we must wait and see whether he can stop the division. In South Korea, the constitution specifies the separation of powers. Under the presidential system, the president symbolized a strong leadership and national integration, but consecutive impeachments significantly damaged that image, I think. The presidency has lost its status, becoming a power with uncertain terms. On the other hand, the National Assembly exercised immense power under the leadership of the Democratic Party. For example, when they disliked the court's response to the martial law crisis, they pushed for a dedicated insurrection division in the court. They also tried to introduce law distortion crime bill that targets judicial officials, such as prosecutors and judges. So critics point out that these actions damage judicial independence and violate the Constitution. However, the Democratic Party is accelerating its drive backed by political legitimacy. And another problem is how frequently the Assembly pulls out the impeachment card. After the Assembly impeached President Yoon, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo acted as president. At that time, the Democratic Party impeached him, claiming that Han fails to maintain political neutrality and interfered with the investigation into Yoon's insurrection charges. As a result, Deputy Prime Minister for Economic Affairs, Choi Sang-mo, became the acting of the acting. In the picture, the left corner. He's in the left corner. At that time, I was working in the economic department, and usually the political department covers the president and the prime minister's office. But as Choi Sang-mo became the acting president, our department had to handle all the reports related to the cabinet meetings and government work as well. Especially then, tariff bombs from President Trump created a great external crisis. So at the time, I found myself genuinely worried about the future of our country for the first time. The martial law was the worst result of political polarization, I think. I will skip how severe the conflict was between the government and the Democratic Party in 2024. To give just one example, over 2 years, the Democratic Party rejected or issued unfit ratings for more than 330 of President Yoon's nominees. This is the list. And despite this, President Yoon pushed through with their appointments anyway. Everyone in South Korea would agree that after the martial law crisis and the impeachment, we should move toward harmony. But according to a recent poll, 77% of people think that politics has become more polarized since the martial law, which is I totally agree. The Democratic Party regards the PPP as an entity it should eliminate. In fact, the Democratic Party leader Jung Chang-nae has openly mentioned that he would request a trial to dissolve the PPP as an unconstitutional party. And on the other hand, the PPP is attacking the Democratic Party as a real insurrection force. And another example is that President Lee Jae-myung tried to show integrated appointments by nominating former PPP lawmaker Lee Hae-hun as a Prime Minister of Planning and Budget. However, the PPP immediately expelled her, calling her move on like act against the party, and they raised various suspicions about her through her former staff. In fact, they have made it impossible for her to pass the hearing. Against this background, many scholars point to structural problems. They say that a winner-takes-all structures of presidential system makes cooperation difficult and inevitably causes conflict. Therefore, whenever a new government forms, the need for constitutional amendment arises. The idea is to create a national assembly where even the majority party must compromise or unite with the opposing party to pass the laws. It is the same now. The President Lee Jae-myung also raised the need for constitutional amendment. And discussion to submit a draft during the June local election is gaining momentum. As you know, the assembly lifted the martial law in 6 hours, and lawmakers later impeached President Yoon. Looking at this, many evaluated that the South Korea's democracy is alive and people protected the spirit of constitution, that all powers comes from the people. But the more fundamental question remains, I think, will such a thing ever happen again in South Korea? I can confidently say that probably not a single Korean could answer no to this question. This shows paradoxically that South Korea's democracy still remains in a fragile state. Voters will strictly judge the actions of both Democratic Party and People Power Party over the past year in the upcoming June election, I think. Though through this, I hope we can see the direction in which South Korea's democracy should move more clearly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hae-kyung, for that fascinating, if a little pessimistic at the end presentation. We're going to shift gears to last but not least, Andrew Yeol's presentation about the foreign policy consequences of this turmoil over the last year.
Thanks, Celeste, and kudos to GWIX for putting together this event. I love the way how you framed it, that it's not just about foreign policy or elections or democracy, but it's really a retrospective of what has happened after martial law and looking at the resilience of democracy and its impact on both domestic institutions and on foreign policy. And I was again just reminded and struck by Representative Lee's comment about this really historic episode. I don't think people understand outside of Korea just how unprecedented this event was. And 10, 20 years from now, when students in your Korea politics class, Celeste, study democracy, or they're gonna look at this episode, and it's I know we have to watch language, but it's a WTF moment, I think. And I think there'll just be a lot of head scratching, but I think it's also important to examine how we got to this point and what the aftermath was. And I'll say I'll talk about the foreign policy, but let me just backtrack to that fateful day on December 3rd. It wasn't just Koreans that were caught off guard. I mean, I was in the US and someone had messaged me a cryptic email, a colleague saying, "Oh, never a busy day for you, at work," and then with a question mark. I had no idea what she was referring to. When I get into work and open my inbox, I see all these emails from reporters, from other people asking about what's happening with Korea. But the US government as well, too, was extremely puzzled when I talk with, former government officials. These are, um, those who worked in the Biden administration and worked closely with Koreans said that there was just, no one knew what's going on. They tried to contact the Korean ambassador, counterparts in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they weren't picking up the phone initially. So it was just a really bizarre moment. And I can say that the world was caught off guard for a couple reasons. One is that President Yoon had talked so much about this idea of a global pivotal state, that South Korea is really instrumental on the global scene, that it provides an example both economically but also politically on how a country can contribute to global public goods. Um, South Korea, as a President Yoon, he had hosted the Summit for Democracy just earlier that year. And he kept talking about South Korea being a liberal democracy, that he wanted to really make South Korean democracy shine. In fact, when I talked with Yoon's first national security advisor, I was asking what's the difference between global pivotal state and Lee Myung-bak's global Korea. So President Lee in 2008, 2009 came up with a global Korea campaign. And former national security advisor, Kim Sang-han, he said the main difference is that that we're focusing much more on liberal democracy, or democracy wasn't really something that was promoted heavily during the Lee government. So despite all that fact, how can you have martial law? So in terms of South Korea's foreign policy, there's a lot of questions about its credibility. And so I think there's a couple consequences because of martial law in that gap between Yoon's impeachment and then the election of President Lee Jae-myung in June 2026. So the first was, of course, this huge credibility gap because of this uncertainty. Where was South Korea's foreign policy heading? Especially when President Yoon had talked so much about democracy, was Korea moving in a step backward? And on that front, I remember that the vice foreign minister at the time he traveled to Washington maybe a couple weeks after martial law, but he also traveled to Europe, to the Middle East. He did a lot of foreign travel. I think the foreign minister could not leave the country, or was right after martial law, because all cabinet officials, they wanted them to stay in the country in case they needed to be investigated. So the vice foreign minister was making the rounds, trying to reassure partners, other countries, that South Korea would fulfill its agreements, any treaty obligations, and that those would be honored. And so they were trying to convey that on the diplomatic front, it would be business as usual. But of course, no one really knew what would happen next in terms of Korean politics. But then the second consequence, which is more specific, I think, to U.S.-South Korea relations, was that a lot of Koreans feared that they would be completely taken advantage of by President Trump. So Trump, of course, was elected in November, and before his inauguration, South Koreans kept using this term Korea passing, meaning that the U.S. would kind of ignore South Korea's interests, that other countries would have a leg up, negotiating with the U.S. on things like tariffs, in terms of security arrangements. And so Koreans felt that they would be disadvantaged and in an unfavorable position to negotiate with President Trump because of martial law and the fallout, and because they didn't have a government in place. Now, I'll say that the interim government, I know Steve and Hae-kyung had talked a little bit about the interim government, but they did their best to kind of hold the fort down when the reciprocal tariff announcements came in early April. Again, they responded. They said that they would try to work with the U.S. to address concerns about the trade imbalance in between U.S. and South Korea trade. and they managed as best as they could, but it turns out in hindsight that it also could have been a hidden blessing that they didn't have a government in place at the time for a few reasons. First is that uh, it bought the Koreans some additional time when it came to negotiating with the United States on tariffs. They could see how other countries might be negotiating. Japan, in particular, was, I think, a good case study for the Koreans in terms of what was being offered, what the Trump administration was looking for. So it bought the Koreans some additional time. I also think that for the U.S., it was clear that the U.S. was not going to negotiate or come to any conclusions until elections, South Korean elections in June, because they knew that if they strike a deal with the Koreans with the interim government, if the then opposition, if the Democratic Party were to come to power, then they wouldn't know, whether whatever was agreed upon would be honored. And so they also waited until there was a government in place. And again, so it goes back to buying time for the South Korean negotiating team. And then I also want to say, in terms of the dynamic between President Lee and President Trump, so before martial law, there were experts in Washington who followed the alliance, who argued that President Yoon would get along pretty well with President Trump just because they had similar characteristics or personalities. They were both very strong figures. We know that Trump likes strong men. He likes authoritarian figures. Surprisingly, Trump never really criticized Yoon for the martial law declaration. So some thought that Trump and Yoon could get along quite well. But, President Lee Jae-myung also had he also had some characteristics that could work well with Trump. And, President Lee, he's talked a lot about a pragmatic foreign policy. So that pragmatism, I think, enabled him to really work with Trump. So Trump is very transactional. And so Lee was very willing to kind of do whatever it would take to ensure that South Korea's interests were protected. And so on an issue like North Korea or diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, that would have never worked with Yoon Suk-Yeol. Yoon Suk-Yeol was extremely anti-North Korea, so there was no way there would be any opportunity for engagement. But President Lee knows that Trump seemed interested in wanting to meet Kim Jong-un or wanting to restart diplomacy. That's, of course, the goal of the Progressive Party with the Democratic Party in Korea. So Lee Jae-myung used that to his advantage. Same thing right now with defense spending. You would think that South Koreans would balk or push back on being asked to raise defense spending to 3% or upwards to 5%. But interestingly, I think this was I don't want to say it was an easy easy for South Koreans to say yes, but fairly early on in the negotiations, when I talked with Korean diplomats, that they were more open to increasing defense spending than other countries. And that's because the progressive parties, they tend to look at increased defense spending as a way of reducing dependence on the United States. So it's more about self-reliance and building up your own military strength. So they could say yes to Trump on that front, and at the same time, they could also press something that they've been pushing for over a decade now, but the transfer of wartime operational control, meaning that they would like the control over the South Korean military in a wartime situation to go back to fall under a South Korean military commander. That's something that would also have been very difficult under Yoon. Let me just close by saying a couple things about democratic resilience and also some challenges that lie ahead because of not so much because of the martial law, but because of where South Korean politics is at today. So on the positive side, we've seen that South Korean democracy has been resilient. It's not perfect, as Representative Lee pointed out, and as others on this panel have mentioned. It's by no means a perfect democracy. In fact, I looked at South Korea's Freedom House index score, and it's 81 on VDEM. It's listed as a flawed democracy, just like the United States. So not a perfect democracy, um, but because of this democratic resilience, because the government was able to hold an election, and you have a party that's now firmly in place, they were able to open. They were able to respond to President Trump's demand when it came to negotiating tariffs and managing the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And I think that's moving forward fairly well. Both sides are talking about alliance modernization. We've seen Trump officials referring to South Korea as a model ally. Undersecretary of Defense Elbridge Colby was in Seoul earlier this week, and he again reiterated this idea that Korea is a model ally for raising its defense, for doing more on the security front. Um, and it's also very difficult, I think, for the Conservative Party right now to criticize President Lee, at least on the foreign policy front, in part because I think the People Power Party, the conservative PPP, I don't think their foreign policy would have differed all that much from Lee, with the exception of North Korea policy. I think the PPP, if they were still in power, would have also had an intense focus on establishing a solid basis for the U.S.-South Korea alliance, and then also in dealing with the tariff threat. That's clearly a matter of national security. And so in some ways, I think with South Korea's democratic resilience, we've seen Seoul being able to put in place a strong foreign policy. In terms of concerns, others have mentioned how South Korea is still very deeply polarized. I did mention that the North Korea issue is a place where progressives and conservatives have very different view. It's not entirely clear where President Lee wants to head. On one hand, he wants to engage with North Korea. He has at the Ministry of Unification, Chung Dong-young, who's heading that agency, who has all sorts of ideas about how to improve the relationship with North Korea, which North Korea is not buying at all. But he's very keen on engagement. But at the same time, President Lee also hasn't rolled back, joint exercises. He says that deterrence is very important. He also talks about denuclearization. He actually said more about denuclearization than probably President Trump. So on that front, like he's also maintained a position that conservatives might. So it's not clear where he's heading, but because of polarization, it's not clear if that will have some kind of influence on North Korea policy. I'll also say that we have to look within. So there's dynamics between the conservative opposition and then the progressive ruling party. But there's also we also have to look at cleavages within the Progressive Party, just as Hae-kyung had mentioned, looking at different factions or tensions within the Conservative Party. In the Progressive Party, there is, roughly these two factions: a pro-alliance faction and what they call it an autonomy faction, one that wants more distance from the U.S. and they want South Koreans to chart their own, foreign policy, one that focuses more on the region, has better relations with China. Right now, the pro-alliance faction is taking the lead, and Lee has followed the advice of his national security advisor, who falls into this pro-alliance camp. But the progressive base may push President Lee in a different direction, and certainly with President Trump, yesterday, so he threatened South Korea with tariffs again. He said he's going to raise tariffs back to 25% if South Korea doesn't move fast enough on, the deal that was negotiated and, implementing investments. If that doesn't happen quick enough, Trump will, the U.S. will go back to tariffs. At some point, South Koreans may say we've had enough of Trump, or we're kind of fed up with the U.S. and its bullying. And that's when I wonder if the progressives may be able to convince Lee, or if Lee may say, well, we may need to change tact on our foreign policy. I think that's a space we need that we might want to look at. But all in all, I think South Korea's foreign policy is fairly robust, and like a South Korean democracy, its foreign policy has made fairly resilient. Back to you, Celeste.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'd like to welcome Stephen and Hae-Young back so we can have a brief panel discussion. I'm going to truncate it a little bit, but pick up on one of Andrew's last points was political polarization. So many observers, as Hae-Young nicely summarized, said that political polarization and the frustration maybe of Yoon Suk-Yeol in dealing with a National Assembly controlled by the Progressive Democratic Party um, may have led him to declare martial law. So in the year since then, um, what's your assessment? Are we seeing signs of less political polarization or improvement in the situation or more? So, for example, we've had lots of recent revelations about improper political ties, or as Hae-Young mentioned, the mistreatment of staff by a minister nominee, online influence peddling by the family members of a lawmaker, real estate and stock manipulation. Are these signs of like greater accountability, greater transparency, or is this the weaponization of the conflict between the progressives and the conservatives? Another way of asking this is, are there any downsides to the concentration of power that we currently have in the Democratic Party or the progressives, holding both the National Assembly and the presidency? So if you look back on the last year, is political polarization getting better or not? And if so, why? I guess, Hae-Young, do you want to start and then we'll go to Stephen and Andrew?
Yeah. Okay. I think that's very difficult question to answer. So while we can get a glimpse of how the public was judging the situation through party approval ratings and polls at the time, but it is difficult to define exactly what the public was thinking because the polls are not perfect. So, but having said that, we can look at the comments made by progressive or conservative columnists or commentators in the media, since they are highly sensitive to the flows of public opinions when they speak. Also, based on those kind of things, it appears that even people who do not typically support the Democratic Party gave their support to the party's strong drive for impeachment because they believed President Yoon should be impeached. At the same time, they showed distrust and the sense of rejection toward the PPP because they seemed to jump on the bandwagon of its hardcore supporters and was not proactive regarding the impeachment. But it is difficult to say that this sentiment translated into genuine trust for any specific party. Fundamentally, the Korean public has an extremely high level of distrust toward Korean politics, and their political fatigue is very substantial. Therefore, except hardcore supporters, very few people believe that either the Democratic Party or the People Power Party makes choice out of sincere desire to uphold the spirit of Constitution or protect democracy. But Korea still adopts a single member district system, as I mentioned earlier. So people has no choice but to pick one of the two major parties. So in the end, there's an aspect where people are forced into a situation where they have to choose between two of a kind. And the martial law crisis caused the first cracks in the rigid structure, but we will have to wait and see how the third, how that trend develops, and ultimately, in a situation where no third alternative exists, we must observe whether citizens will be forced to choose one of the two, or whether a third force will emerge, or whether finally constitutional reform will take place.
Thanks. I think Assemblywoman, you mentioned the importance of compromise and civic dialogue. So, Stephen, in your answer, if you could reflect on any signs of that emerging in your view, or
Yes,
what your assessment of political polarization is.
I think first of all, I would go a little bit out on a limb here. I would avoid the term polarization. I don't think it's helpful. I think it's simply too general, and it serves to whitewash and take us away from looking at what's really going on. Um, in South Korea's 28 years of modern democracy, they've had um, four so-called conservative figures. The first one, Lee Myung-bak, was arrested and prosecuted and jailed after his presidency for corruption. The second one, Park Geun-hye, was impeached for corruption, and then she was jailed too. The third one, Yoon Suk-Yeol, has been impeached and is in jail and awaiting sentence. This isn't a left versus right polarization issue in that sense. Those are the remnants of the forces, the power forces, the power groups that existed up to and through the Korean War. So sort of pro-Japanese, anti-democratic forces have been bubbling up ever since. One of the graphs that Hae-young showed was, I think, one of the threads here that are really meaningful because, and she noted this many times, that the Korean public seems to respond more in these times to issues of sort of constitutional and democratic um, uh, uh, commitment rather than to, political leanings in many of the most important cases. As Hae-young said, that happened a lot in the election of the recent president, Lee Jae-myung, and it's happening when it comes to public pressure on the courts for things like that. So the real division in Korea um, for all these years has been between anti-democratic forces on the one hand and pro-democratic forces on the other. That's what it is. Of course, among Democrats, small d Democrats, there are different factions. You can see that today, that the party leader is somewhat in conflict with members of his caucus and with the president, blah, blah, blah. But this democratic and anti-democratic cleavage is really the most important. For that reason, when we go forward, the other thing I would say about that is when you look at the National Assembly, the behavior of the People Power Party, one of the sort of blinking yellow lights about the People Power Party and the whole so-called conservative group is that they are policy empty. That is to say that on issues that really affect people's everyday lives and issues at the heart of modernizing and upgrading the South Korean system, they don't have any ideas and nothing that's practical. In their first months in office after Yoon Suk-Yeol was elected, and he was elected partly by embracing this misogynist anti-woman party. I mean, that's a deep part of the PPP's DNA. So that, together with these other elements, really exposed the PPP to these charges of whether or not it can be a contributing party in a democracy. I think that's the question. Other thing I would say, I mean, a brief shout out. I hate to be shameless here, but I wrote an article for the East Asia Forum in January of 2024, okay, a year before Yoon's martial law. And in it, I tried to showcase the foreign policy of Yoon and the domestic issues that were mounting to affect that foreign policy. And it's one of many articles out there, but I think in a way I tried to address this question. So I would urge people who care about this to maybe check that out. East Asia Forum 2024. So the
Thank you.
final thing I'd say is, yes, in any democracy, there are opposing forces. That's not polarization by itself. And I think the South Korean public has shown itself, as again, Hae-kyung's graph made out, that they're responding more to these issues of, well, do you support a constitutional order and democratic processes, or do you stand against them? Do you refuse to even attend the National Assembly as an assembly person? Is that your idea of how a democracy should work? or do you get in there and work? The final thing I would say is that accusations that the current progressive government is somehow dictatorial, and even these assertions that we need to somehow force compromise in the assembly, I think those are all fake, in the sense that, of course, in an assembly you have different positions. But the whole point of an assembly is that you elect people popularly in real elections. And if a majority wants to put forward legislation and they have the numbers, that's the way the system works. You could oppose that system, but it's hard to say that when that system works, you call them dictatorial. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think one core piece of the polarization is what Hae-kyung described as winner takes all, or the mutual intolerance. So an unwillingness to hear or consider the other. Andrew, if you're okay with it, I'm going to go to the audience questions now for the sake of time. Sorry to cut you off from the roundtable. One of our visiting scholars, Dojin, asked the question for Hae-kyung, do you see a possibility that voters who have become politically unaffiliated or undecided may regroup and realign with either political camp as the local elections approach? And I think this gets at Stephen's last point.
Yeah. This is exactly what I'm wondering about as well. As one of Korean citizen and journalist, it's truly difficult to predict. Back in 2022, while I was covering the PPP as a political reporter, and I watched Yoon Suk-Yeol be elected as an opposition candidate and eventually become the president. Even then, I couldn't predict it at all. At the time, I didn't even imagine he would become the final candidate in the primary because he was a former prosecutor who had just resigned and with no political power and no base within the party. So among politicians and political reporters, there's a saying like we always keep in mind, it ain't over till it's over. So whenever election seasons comes around, all sort of polls comes out, but they are often inaccurate. And this is why it is truly hard to gauge what will happen next. But the will those who turn their back on PPP unite again when the election comes? Historically, we've seen that pattern repeat. No matter how much the party messed up, regional loyalty would kick in, often summed up by the phrase like "we are one of us" and bring voters back together. So there is certainly a chance that might happen again. However, since the PPP has yet to clearly distance itself from the present insurrectionist faction and continues to cater only to its hardcore base, I think it will be difficult to win back those who left or remained unaligned unless they show real change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to take further this question about the future of the PPP in the aftermath. And maybe, Andrew, if I can ask you to jump in on this. Sunny Kim asks, do you think that the PPP's collapsed, or at least its internal rivalries and divisions that are coming to the fore right now, due to their protection of the former President Yoon, mean this is the end of the conservative bloc in Korea? I think Hae-kyung just proposed that this is not likely to be the end of the conservative bloc and that we'll see a new one emerge, just like after Park Geun-hye's impeachment in 2017, the conservatives regrouped. Is there an issue? I mean, you mentioned, for example, foreign policy, Andrew, minus the North Korea question, on which you could see the conservatives regrouping, or is it more about power?
I think it's immediately about power. The PPP, I don't think is going to disappear. It's not going to turn into, we're not going to see like a single party or main party just dominating Korean politics like the LDP. PPP is definitely in shambles, and I think it's gonna take more than one election cycle for it to rebuild. I think they rebuilt fairly quickly after Park Geun-hye's impeachment, but I think it'll take longer this time. What's frustrating is when I see I've met youngish PPP National Assembly members who have really good ideas and who wanted to distance themselves from martial law. I was at the National Assembly in January 2025, so shortly after martial law, and they were also strategizing like how they can move ahead. And I think because of the way the party hierarchy works, that they couldn't really be as outspoken, but they definitely wanted to distance themselves from martial law. But I feel like their voices never really come to the surface. And but at the same time, you can do a splinter party. But we saw what happened in 2017. There was like the Bareun Mire당. It was like an offshoot. They're kind of centrist former. Um, at the time, it's called like the Liberty Party. There was the previous name of Liberty Party of Korea, the previous name of the PPP. And they tried to form their own party with more reform-minded conservatives, but they just kind of fell to the wayside. And I think that's because of the two-party system. So my sense is we'll see some future reiteration of the PPP that can compete with the Democratic Party, but it's going to take a few years.
Thank you. I'm going to skip over, in a sense, Annie's really large question about the way in which polarization in Korean democracy is similar or different to the United States situation, given that we also have a two-party system. But to this question of what to do in Korea, let's stay focused on Korean politics for today. Um, Eun-Sik Jung asks, first, thanks to all of the speakers for their insightful presentations, and then asks about constitutional revision, for example, as to reform the excessive power concentration in the hands of the presidency. I think, Andrew, you were suggesting maybe internal party reforms might be needed to provide ways for younger or more moderate voices to be heard within the party. That may also apply to the US context as well. Or legal reforms such as limiting the use of emergency powers like martial law. Stephen, do you want to take on this question?
Yeah, that's good. Um, I think that limiting of powers is important. You know, party structures. We should remember that since modern Korean democracy, I can remember from 1990 that this issue of a constitutional reform so that you would no longer have a single 5-year term and that you would change probably to a two possibility 4-year terms, you know, like the US presidential system. That was very much in the air. It was very much proposed and pushed by large factions among Democrats. Um, that's 36 years ago, you know, and of course, when Kim Dae-jung came to power, it was very much in the air, but that was a coalition government. There's no way to get the support for that. So, but it answers this question very much because ironically, the single term, 5-year single term, actually gives any particular president even more power. Or at least they feel more licensed. They have 5 years. Oh my God, they have to do everything. They have to put their own stamp on it, you know, blah, blah, blah. Whereas if you had two 4-year terms, there would be much more incentive for that president to build a coalition, not only his party, but others, to think about maybe a second term. Do they really want to elect me again? So that's, you're absolutely right. Constitutional revision in that sense would be very important. Other constitutional changes. I mean, the behavior of the political parties is important. I really think that former congressman, former assemblyman uh, Lee Hae-chan was one of those who pushed early on for introduction of the primary system. Very big deal. And Hae-kyung must know this too, that, you know, back in the 90s, when party leaders, when I started all this in the early 90s, they would get in a room and decide who would be on their list for, you know, on the election, running an election for certain districts. It would be a choice of the party leaders, period. But then they introduced a primary system, and that opened it up in a much more healthy democratic way to different figures actually vying for public support. So that was in a way one of the most important, maybe non-constitutional, but the important changes. Today, I think, yes, as my other panelists have said, the introduction of certainly younger people into the party, the openness of a party, so that not only the most senior figures are the only ones who make party policy. That's a very important ongoing thing for all political parties. A final thing to say would be about yes, could the PPP somehow go away? Could the DP rule? No, I agree with Andrew on that. This isn't something where the DP could turn into the LDP of Japan. Um, Partly because there are different factions within the DP. This is, what are the Democrats everywhere? They always have fights among them. They have a hell of a time collaborating. Um, but the PPP, I would focus on that. I would zoom out a bit. The PPP, in my sense, has been a power group rather than a political party since democracy arrived in 1988, or I'm sorry, 98. In the sense that it hasn't had a policy except to define itself as anti-communist, against the Democrats, pro-big business, and the military. This was their DNA under Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan, and it's their DNA today, or at least, without something else. Until there emerges level-headed conservatives, democratic conservatives. Let's use that phrase. Until that emerges, of course, the DP will be the preeminent party for anybody who believes in democracy. Duh. Going back to the 90s, I would just say that there were discussions about how even with Democrats leading, they need a responsible conservative party. And people were searching around, how's that going to happen? That question sits out there today. I don't know the answer.
I think since we are running out of time, I think Stephen, you gave us this one question: how to watch in the months ahead. What are we going to have, or how are we going to have a responsible conservative party as the PPP adjusts in this post-martial law era? I think Hae-kyung, you also gave us a sense of the importance of Korean voters in speaking out, and Assemblywoman Yi also highlighted um, the the role of Korean voters who are not willing to sit by and will not be patient if power is abused. And then Andrew, I think you provided us with a lot of nice examples of how the limbo in governance in Korea may not have been all bad for South Korean national interests and foreign policy and trade policy. But certainly the uncertainties with the Trump administration met uncertainties in Seoul as well. So as Seoul addresses the ups and downs of foreign policy with the Trump administration, as we saw with the tariff announcement from the president yesterday, these are all challenges going forward, and hopefully we can be cautiously optimistic that Korean democracy will remain resilient and that the Korean voters will have a say in the process, and that civil dialogue and compromise and mutual tolerance may be restored. But for the sake of time, we're not going to solve all of these problems today, but I want you to please join me in thanking our esteemed speakers for their insightful remarks today, and encourage you to join us for future GWIX events. And otherwise, stay safe and warm amid all the snow. Thank you again to our speakers.
Celeste, and thanks to the other panelists.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Celeste. Thank you, guys.